Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. The section's titled Philosophy, Science, and Marxism. In the whole of the voluminous writings of Trotsky spanning some 40 years, there are very few which can be defined as, quote, philosophical. As a young man, Trotsky took an interest in works of philosophy and even wrote a perceptive essay on Nietzsche. But this interest derived primarily from that sense of obligation towards works of the intellect, which a normally curious and ambitious nature engenders in someone embarking upon the early stages of self-education. And in any case, the interest did not last long. Very much later in life, Trotsky professed to have rediscovered an interest in philosophy and expressed the ambition to write a, quote, big and serious, end quote, philosophical work, but this never materialized and is doubtful whether, even given the time and conditions, Trotsky would have patience for it. Footnote. See Trotsky's diary in exile, where Trotsky wrote, quote, "My philosophical interests have been growing during the last few years, but alas, my knowledge is too insufficient, and too little time remains for a big and serious work," end quote. Trotsky says that Trotsky has just, May 1935, written, quote, "a little about the interrelationship between the physiological determinism of brain processes and the, quote, autonomy, end quote, of thought, which is subject to the laws of logic," end quote. But Trotsky does not appear to have preserved this, quote, essay, end footnote. The fact is that both by temperament and by natural capacity, Trotsky's mind was at its most content and at its greatest ease when dealing with political, sociological, and historical subjects. Although allusions to Hegel, to Kant, and to other philosophers and philosophies abound in Trotsky's writings, it is difficult to see Trotsky writing a, quote, treatise, such as, for instance, Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism, whatever the actual philosophical merits of Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism, not to mention the same author's jottings on Hegel, Feuerbach, Marx, and others posthumously published as philosophical notebooks. Unlike Lenin, Trotsky made no pretensions to philosophical expertise and on the whole avoided dabbling even in Marxist philosophy. Trotsky had, in any case, an aversion to textual analysis and exegesis. In the case of Marxism, Trotsky generally accepted Marxism's fundamental axioms without further ado. As a system of thought, Trotsky took Marxism, above all, to be a, quote, method which should be utilized for further explorations into social and political developments. Consequently, and as should be abundantly clear from all that has been written in this study, Trotsky's thought dealt with theoretical problems of a socio-political nature, not with more abstract issues of a philosophical kind. From time to time, however, excursions into such philosophical subjects as, quote, dialectical materialism proved unavoidable, particularly in the late 1930s when among his former followers, Marxism came under general attack. Trotsky felt it necessary to return to fundamentals since not only some specific tenets of Marxism were being questioned, but Marxism's very foundations. In the event, as we shall see, Trotsky's defense of Marxism was neither original nor very convincing. In fact, Trotsky's defense of Marxism showed that Trotsky was not altogether free of the kind of obsession for attributing to Marx a grandiose and inflated philosophy of, quote, man and nature, end quote, which so often took a hold of Engels and in some of their writings, Lenin, Plekhanov, Bukharin, and others. Footnote. It is by now fairly clear that Marx made fewer, quote, philosophical, end quote, claims for his work, especially as concerns the subject of, quote, dialectical materialism, than some of Marx's followers later attributed to Marx. This is not to say anything about Marx's, quote, early writings, which eventually became so fashionable, but which are not an issue here since neither Trotsky nor most of his contemporaries were aware of the early works. Despite Engels' frequent protestations that Engels was merely summarizing, so to speak, Marx's theoretical conclusions, there seems no doubt that Engels went far beyond Marx in this sphere, even allowing for their collaboration on such, quote, philosophical works as The Holy Family and the German Ideology, and for the fact that some of Engels' own philosophical tracts were written while Marx was still alive. Engels' main treatises on, quote, dialectical materialism are Herr Eugen Dühring's Revolution in Science, or Anti-Dühring, published in 1878, and Dialectics of Nature, written between 1873 and 1883. Lenin's major excursion into this field is Materialism and Imperialist Criticism, published originally in 1909. Plekhanov's best-known philosophical work is The Development of the Monist View of History of 1895. For Bukharin's contribution, see his Historical Materialism, published in 1921, for an account of these works as well as the subsequent history of the idea of, quote, dialectical materialism in Soviet history. See Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism. I actually have been meaning to read this book because I also have read, A History of Dialectical Materialism, by Z.A. Jordan. The description for Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey of philosophy in the Soviet Union. The description says, this book surveys the history of dialectical materialism from dialectical materialism's Hegelian beginnings to the death of Stalin, and its sequel in the celebrated 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Vetter's book also presents a systematic account of the theory of dialectical materialism as dialectical materialism was formulated and discussed by the philosophers of the Soviet Union. Back to the text. Shlomo Avineri's The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx is an interpretation which inter alia seeks to liberate Marx from Engels. Amongst Marxists, Georg Lukács attempted to do the same in his History and Class Consciousness, and as did Karl Korsch in Marxism and Philosophy, published in English in 1970. End footnote. Trotsky, too, it would emerge, insisted on attaching great importance to some of the, quote, sacred cows of Marxist philosophy. Footnote, for the, quote, unimportance of, quote, dialectical materialism to Marxist social theory, see Plemenet's German Marxism and Russian Communism. I'm not really seeing any descriptions for this book. One second. Where are we at? Okay. End footnote. Before turning, however, to these, quote, philosophical writings of the late 1930s, it will be useful to look back at some of Trotsky's somewhat more tempered reflections on Marxist philosophy of a decade or so earlier. Trotsky's position on, quote, dialectical materialism may be said to have originated when, in the mid-1920s, during a brief lull in Trotsky's political activities, Trotsky developed an interest in science, or rather the philosophy of science, and by way of this, in the relationship between science and Marxist philosophy. Footnote. This interest in science was prompted by the fact that in 1925, after being relieved of Trotsky's duties at the Commissariat of War, Trotsky had been appointed head of the Board for Electrotechnical Development and chairman of the Committee for Industry and Technology. These appointments, Trotsky observed in his autobiography, were meant to isolate Trotsky from political activity. Nevertheless, Trotsky approached them seriously and gladly took a, quote, rest from politics, concentrating on questions of natural science and technology, end quote. Trotsky recalled that Trotsky visited laboratories, watched experiments, studied, quote, textbooks on chemistry and hydrodynamics. End footnote. It would be a gross exaggeration, of course, to claim that Trotsky himself formulated anything so comprehensive as a philosophy of science. Trotsky's writings on science were sparse and neither particularly original nor free from the novice's dilettantism, but Trotsky had a clear grasp of the issues raised by, quote, dialectical materialism for the sciences in general, and of the impact, conversely, of scientific development and discoveries upon the foundations of Marxist philosophy. Trotsky defended and sought to vindicate the principles of, quote, dialectical materialism, but Trotsky did so at this time without the usual sententiousness and pomposity found in Marxist literature on this subject. Moreover, while Trotsky obviously considered its philosophical scaffolding to be an integral part of Marxism, Trotsky was aware of the distinction between Marxism as philosophy and Marxism as science. All this is most evident in a long lecture Trotsky delivered in 1925 to a scientific congress on the subject of the work and thought of the famous Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev. Dmitry Mendeleev was a Russian chemist and inventor. Dmitry Mendeleev is best known for formulating the periodic law and creating a version of the periodic table of elements. Dmitry Mendeleev used the periodic law not only to correct the then accepted properties of some known elements, but as the valence and atomic weight of uranium, such as the valence and atomic weight of uranium, but also to predict the properties of three elements that were yet to be discovered: germanium, gallium, and scandium. Back to the text. Mendeleev, Trotsky pointed out, had frequently denounced dialectics. He believed in the immutability and stability of chemical elements, in their non-transformation into one another. In fact, however, Trotsky asserted, Mendeleev's discovery of the new elements, like Mendeleev's drawing up of the, quote, periodic table of elements, end quote, in general, was a vindication of, quote, dialectical materialism, according to which quantitative differences eventually result in qualitative change. The same could be said for Darwin's theories of evolution, which Trotsky believed were in effect an application of Hegel's laws of the dialectic to the sphere of organic life. Footnote: Trotsky was always an ardent admirer of Darwin's scientific ideas, if not Darwin's social ideas. In 1901, Trotsky wrote a short essay in which Trotsky mockingly described the backwardness of Russian social thought, which, in the example Trotsky gave, expressed itself through an attempt to substitute for the, quote, materialist English Darwin, end quote, a, quote, idealist Russian, end quote, one. End footnote. That neither Mendeleev nor Darwin were aware of the, quote, dialectical implications of Mendeleev and Darwin's discoveries had to be attributed, in Trotsky's view, to Mendeleev and Darwin's conservative frame of mind, shaped as their frame of mind was by Mendeleev and Darwin's social backgrounds and environments. Footnote: this, quote, social explanation, end quote, is, of course, transparently feeble, but inadvertently, perhaps, this social explanation suggests that Trotsky was aware of the fact that commitment to, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, had more to do with one's political outlook than one's scientific convictions. End footnote. Mendeleev, Trotsky noted, had done much to free science of the need for postulating the existence of some, quote, superphysical or, quote, superchemical vital force, end quote, to explain the relationships between various scientific phenomena. Trotsky believed that chemistry could in the end be reduced. I'm not sure if he's being referred to here. Maybe it's Mendeleev. I don't know. Mendeleev believed that chemistry could in the end be reduced to the physical and mechanical properties of chemistry's compounds, thus creating a unitary foundation for all the sciences. Trotsky agreed that, in the last resort, psychology was reducible to physiological processes to chemical processes, and these in turn to physical and mechanical processes. The same, Trotsky added, could in principle be said about sociology, since society was a, quote, product of the development of primary matter, end quote. Scientific thought, therefore, could through the complex layers and phenomena of social behavior, cut through the complex layers and phenomena of social behavior to the underlying components of matter with their, quote, physical and mechanical properties, end quote. Trotsky. By thus momentarily conceding the reducibility in principle of all phenomena to mechanical properties, Trotsky perhaps went further towards a mechanical, not dialectical view of nature than Trotsky may have wished to do. End footnote. Nevertheless, Trotsky hastened to point out this was only so in principle. In practice, the sciences, whether physiology and chemistry, or psychology and sociology, were not, quote, directly reducible to mechanics. In principle, science had to subscribe to some unitary conception of the universe. Otherwise, scientists could not relate the different areas in which those scientists worked. In fact, however, each science functioned in accordance with that science's own discoveries and laws. One could not understand a chemical reaction, for example, by simply resorting to the philosophical contention that chemistry was rooted in physics and mechanics. Quote, chemistry has its own keys. Chemistry has its own keys. One can find those keys only through experience and generalization, through the chemical laboratory, chemical hypotheses, and chemical theory, end quote. Trotsky. The whole trend in the sciences was towards greater and greater specialization, for only in this way could detailed laws be established and empirical experimentation carried out. Thus each field of science was autonomous, and the laws governing one field were not transposable to or reducible from another. Quote, a scientist would hardly carry over without modification the laws governing the movement of atoms into the movement of molecules, which is governed by other laws, end quote. Trotsky. And if this was so regards the relationship among the natural sciences, how much more evident was it in the relationship between them and social science? Social science, too, was an autonomous field. From the laws of nature, one could neither learn very much about social behavior nor deduce social laws. Quote, of course, the life of human society, interlaced with material conditions, surrounded on all sides by chemical processes, itself represents, in the final analysis, a combination of chemical processes, ... However, public life is neither a chemical nor a physiological process, but a social process which is shaped according to its own laws, and these in turn are subject to an objective sociological analysis whose aim should be to acquire the ability to foresee and to master the fate of society, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky concluded, therefore, that it was fallacious to look to the natural sciences for a key to, or perspectives upon, society, and, conversely, that it was no less fallacious to presume that Marxism, as a social science, offered a, quote, universal master key, end quote, to the physical universe. Such a presumption meant, quote, ignoring all other spheres of learning, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. The irrelevance of Marxism, as argued by Trotsky in connection with military strategy, was discussed in Chapter 6. End footnote. This was a forceful plea for recognizing the heterogeneity of the sciences. Trotsky contraposed it to the mechanistic views of Mendeleev in order to stress the supposedly dialectical, not uniform, relationship between the sciences, by pointing out the extent of scientific specialization and diversification. Trotsky also sought to emphasize the need for an overall philosophy of science which would, presumably, transcend the limits of each science and thereby offer the scientist a general conception of the nature of man and the universe. This philosophy, Trotsky believed, was to be found in, quote, dialectical materialism. Less than a year after his lecture on Mendeleev, Trotsky delivered a speech in which Trotsky argued that the phenomena of radioactivity had confirmed the dialectical principle of the transmutation of quantitative differences into qualitative changes. Footnote. This speech, delivered in March 1926 to the first All-Union Congress of the Society of Friends of Radio, contained the following prediction, quote, the atom contains within itself an enormous hidden energy, and the greatest task of physics today consists in pumping out this energy, pulling out the cork so that this latent energy may burst forth like a fountain. Then the possibility will open up of replacing coal and petrol by atomic energy, which will become the basic motive power. This is not at all a hopeless task, and what prospects it promises to open up. It alone gives us the right to declare that scientific and technical thought is approaching a great turning point, that the revolutionary era in the development of human society parallels a revolutionary era in man's understanding of matter and man's mastery over matter. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Where am I? Come on, you son of a gun. It may be argued, however, that, in a sense, Trotsky's defense of, quote, dialectical materialism did much to deflate dialectical materialism's ambitious pretensions. The view that each science was an autonomous principality, with that science's own laws but incapable of decreeing laws for others, suggested that the kind of general laws of nature upon which, quote, dialectical materialism depended were not within the realms of science to establish. Quote, dialectical materialism could therefore be seen as a philosophical outlook accompanying scientific work, but not necessarily integral to the latter's creativeness. Moreover, Marxism itself could be grasped as, first of all, an independent, quote, science, applying the methods of historical materialism, while the dialectical variety remained a matter of its philosophical afterthoughts. At the very least, Trotsky agreed, as we have noted, that Marxism was not the, quote, universal master key, end quote, which some of Marxism's exponents had made Marxism out to be. If, however, the, quote, dialectic appealed to Trotsky, as the quote, dialectic obviously did, this was, it seems, because intellectually, the, quote, dialectic was more fascinating to Trotsky than the dry mechanism of the purely empirical or behavioral approach to scientific investigation. It is interesting to notice in this context Trotsky's attitude toward two very different schools of psychology, that of Pavlov, which was much favored in the Soviet Union, and that of Freud, which was much frowned upon. Trotsky did his best to pay respect to Pavlov's work, but Trotsky could conceal neither Trotsky's fundamental distaste for a theory, which reduced everything to, quote, reflexes, nor his fascination with the opposite theory which he believed endeavored to plumb the depths of human consciousness, and was, at the same time, full of suggestive, albeit speculative ideas about human motivation. Beneath a tactful but not convincing attempt to reconcile the two schools, Trotsky clearly preferred, though not without reservation, the less rigidly empirical approach of the Freudians. In 1923, Trotsky wrote a short letter to Pavlov in which Trotsky tried to convince Pavlov that Pavlov's school and that of Freud had much in common, since both were ultimately based on given physiological phenomena, in the case of Freud, that of the sexual urge. Footnote: Deutscher, in The Prophet Unarmed, who incidentally erroneously dates this letter as from 1922, suggests that although Trotsky included it in his Sachznenia, he may never have actually sent it to Pavlov. In the letter, Trotsky reveals that already during his years in Vienna, prior to World War I, Trotsky had read the works of the Freudians and had even attended their gatherings. End footnote. Although Freud's hypotheses, Trotsky admitted, were sometimes, quote, arbitrary from a scientific point of view, Freud's hypotheses had much to offer in the way of comprehending the unconscious motivations behind physiological responses. Thus, the two schools were not really incompatible. Quote, your theory of conditioned reflexes encompasses, it seems to me, Freud's theory of a particular case. The sublimation of sexual energy, a favorite theme of the Freudian school, is a formulation on sexual bases of the conditioned reflexes, N+1, N+2, and so on. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Some 2 months after this letter to Pavlov was written, Trotsky, in a letter to a Congress of Scientific Workers, chided Pavlov for presuming that the scientific study of physiology could solve all problems of human social relationships. End footnote. This was a muted plea for at least keeping one's mind open to Freud's teachings. Some 3 years later, however, when he broached the Freud-Pavlov comparison again, Trotsky was less reserved. Trotsky raised it in his article on, quote, culture and socialism, as part of the general theme that the socialist revolution must be receptive to all currents of enlightening scientific and cultural thought, no matter what the ideological milieu in which they originated. On the one hand, Trotsky again praised Pavlov's, quote, experimental and, quote, painstaking work. The fact that Pavlov erased the frontiers between physiology and psychology, and that Pavlov proceeded, quote, entirely along the paths of dialectical materialism, end quote, accumulating, quote, physiological quantity, end quote, which produced, quote, psychological quality, end quote. In the same breath, however, Trotsky sarcastically rebuked Pavlov for assuming that Pavlov's methods could throw as much light on poetry as his methods had on the saliva of dogs. Quote, the paths that brings us to poetry have yet to be revealed, end quote. If they could be revealed, however, Trotsky suggested that it was Freud's psychoanalysis which was more adequately equipped to do so. Quote, the psychoanalyst does not approach problems of consciousness experimentally, going from the lowest phenomena to the highest, from the simple reflex to the complex. Instead, the psychoanalyst attempts to take all those intermediate stages in one jump, from above downwards, from the religious myth, the lyrical poem, or the dream, straight to the physiological basis of the psyche. End quote. Trotsky. Summarizing the differences between Pavlov and Freud, Trotsky painted the following picture of Pavlov and Freud's, quote, methodological approaches. The idealist tells us that the psyche is an independent entity, that the, quote, soul is a bottomless well. Both Pavlov and Freud think that the bottom of the, quote, soul is physiology. But Pavlov, like a diver, descends to the bottom and laboriously investigates the well from there upwards. Freud, on the other hand, stands over the well and with penetrating gaze tries to perceive its ever-shifting and troubled waters, and to make out or guess the shape of things down below, end quote. Trotsky. The drawbacks of a theory which could not, as a rule, rely on empirical experimentation to verify its claims were only too obvious. But this, Trotsky concluded, was no reason to exclude psychoanalysis from one's intellectual and cultural environment. Quote, the attempt to declare psychoanalysis, quote, incompatible, end quote, with Marxism, and simply turn one's back on Freudism is too simple, or, more accurately, too simplistic. But we are in any case not obliged to adopt Freudism. It is a working hypothesis which can produce and undoubtedly does produce deductions and conjectures which proceed along the lines of materialist psychology. The experimental procedure will in due course provide the tests for these conjectures. But we have no grounds and no right to put a ban on the other procedure, which even though it may be less reliable, yet tries to anticipate the conclusions towards which the experimental procedure is advancing only very slowly. End quote, Trotsky. In a footnote, Trotsky added, quote, this question has, of course, nothing in common with the cultivation of a sham Freudism as an erotic indulgence or piece of, quote, naughtiness. Such claptrap has nothing to do with science and merely expresses decadent moods. The center of gravity is shifted from the cortex to the spinal cord, end quote. Trotsky. That Trotsky should attempt to give a, quote, materialist gloss to psychoanalysis, whatever the basis for this, may be easily dismissed as a bit of ideological wishful thinking aimed at, quote, legitimizing what was ideologically, in fact, problematical. Footnote. In an earlier passage, Trotsky wrote, quote, psychoanalysis assumes in advance that the driving force of the most complex and delicate of psychic processes is a physiological need. In this general sense, psychoanalysis is materialistic. If you leave aside the question whether it does not assign too big a place to the sexual factor at the expense of other factors, for this is already a dispute within the frontiers of materialism, end quote. Already in 1923, in Literature and Revolution, Trotsky declared that in his view, psychoanalysis could be, quote, reconciled, end quote, with materialism. End footnote. Its supposed materialist foundation was not in any case the main motivation behind Trotsky's plea on behalf of psychoanalysis. As the passages quoted above partly show, Trotsky was drawn to psychoanalysis primarily because psychoanalysis was, Trotsky thought, intellectually stimulating, because psychoanalysis dared to speculate upon the most profound issues of human behavior, whether conscious or unconscious, and because it was more imaginative and enterprising than the productive but plodding and ultimately limited and limiting behaviorist school of Pavlov. Footnote. In later years, Trotsky often made observations on psychoanalysis and did not abandon Trotsky's overall admiration for psychoanalysis. For example, in Trotsky's 1932 speech at Copenhagen, Trotsky said, quote, psychoanalysis, with the inspired hand of Sigmund Freud, has lifted the cover of the well, which is poetically called the, quote, soul, and what has been revealed. Our conscious thought is only a small part of the work of the dark psychic forces. Learned divers descend to the bottom of the ocean and there take photographs of mysterious fishes. Human thought, descending to the bottom of its own psychic sources, must shed light on the most mysterious driving forces of the soul and subject them to reason and will, end quote. In the preface to his autobiography, My Life, Trotsky candidly remarks that it is for, quote, psychoanalytical criticism, end quote, to decide whether, in this work, his memory, quote, expels or drives into a darker corner episodes not convenient to the vital instincts that controls it, usually ambition, end quote. At the outset of Trotsky's comments on Lenin's testament, there is a scathing disparagement of Emil Ludwig for, quote, hawking in Emil Ludwig's books a vulgar and dishonest popularization of Freud's techniques. Freud, as against this, is portrayed as a heroic figure, ruthlessly breaking with all conventions in order to arrive at the truth. End footnote. Where am I? Perhaps in this, Trotsky anticipated the later fascination of some Marxists, though not Soviet Marxists, with Freud. Footnote. Of the many Marxist or neo-Marxist works which have since attempted to, quote, synthesize Marx and Freud, two are particularly well known: Erich Fromm, The Fear of Freedom, and Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. Not surprisingly, both of these authors were among the first to resurrect the, quote, early or, quote, young Marx, i.e. the Marx who spoke about, quote, alienation. Marcuse, in particular, has also emphasized the importance in this, as in other connections, of the Hegelian origins of Marx's thought. Ironically, therefore, it may be that the, quote, reconciliation between Marx and Freud, to the extent that it has been effected, has been a consequence of the, quote, dematerialization of Marx. End footnote. At any rate, the compatibility or incompatibility of Freudian psychology with materialism and the, quote, dialectic was, if not altogether an irrelevancy from a scientific point of view, largely an ideological or political issue. And Trotsky himself clearly sensed this when Trotsky urged that psychoanalysis at least be given a dispassionate hearing to prove or disprove itself over time in accordance with scientific criteria. The example of his attitude to Freud, however, should not lead us to underestimate the significance which Trotsky ultimately attached to the materialist philosophy of Marxism. If in the 1920s one could sense a general reasonableness, a lack of pedantry, cant and sanctimoniousness in Trotsky's approach to the, quote, dialectic, the impression is quite the opposite when one turns to some of Trotsky's pronouncements on the subject in 1939 and in 1940. Perhaps it was the intensity and proximity of the then attack on Marxist philosophy. The attack came from hitherto loyal followers as Max Shachtman and James Burnham, which animated Trotsky at this time to take to extreme, passionate, and almost consistently wrong-headed and dogmatic a position on the essentiality of, quote, dialectical materialism to Marxism, or perhaps it was the doubts about the future of socialism voiced in Trotsky's article, The USSR in War, which prompted Trotsky to restate, lest it be suspected, his faith in Marxist doctrine. Whatever the case, Trotsky argued as if the whole future of the Marxist movement, not to mention Marxist social theory, depended on rescuing the philosophy of the, quote, materialist dialectic from its detractors, and Trotsky unhesitatingly seems to take upon himself this mission. One second. Trotsky's polemic, for such it was basically, despite the ostensibly rarefied atmosphere of Trotsky's polemic's subject matter, was unleashed in the characteristically scathing style Trotsky reserved for such occasions, in a series of articles and letters written in 1939 and 1940, and later published in English in the posthumous but appropriately entitled In Defense of Marxism. I have most of the pieces from In Defense of Marxism on this channel. Footnote. Most of these articles and letters originally appeared in Russian in the opposition bulletin. For convenience, however, all subsequent references are to the English version in Defense of Marxism. The original 1942 edition, some have already been referred to in a different context in Chapter 10 above. End footnote. In Defense of Marxism's main contentions may be readily and briefly summarized, for they are neither complicated nor original, and it is their general tenor and import which are of interest. Burnham and Shachtman, as well as others, had argued that acceptance of Marxist social theory and political goals need not commit one to accept Marxist philosophy, specifically, quote, dialectical materialism. One could adopt a different world outlook or none at all and still remain a loyal and effective Marxist. To this, Trotsky retorted that to divest Marxism of Marxism's own philosophical underpinnings and claim that Marxism could carry out Marxism's theoretical and practical tasks just as well without Marxism's philosophical underpinnings or with others was like depriving a worker of the worker's good tools and assuming that the worker could do his job just as well with no tools or with defective tools. Where am I? Or, what was fundamentally the same, it was like defending the right of a Marxist to subscribe to some religious philosophy who would deny that this was not detrimental to practical revolutionary activity. That the opponents of, quote, dialectical materialism proposed to substitute for it not religion but empiricism, or the American, quote, national philosophy of pragmatism did not, in Trotsky's view, make matters any better. Marxist social theory, political strategy, and philosophy were, in the first and last analysis, inseparable, mutually dependent, virtually symbiotic. Concrete problems could not be isolated from abstract problems. Nothing so much attested to this, he believed, as the fact that those who had begun by rejecting the, quote, dialectic only, finished by rejecting Marxism virtually altogether. Witness the, quote, revisionism of Bernstein and Kautsky, not to mention that of Struve and other, quote, legal Marxists. Footnote. Among more recent examples, Trotsky offered Max Eastman and Sidney Hook. For Trotsky's much earlier 1933 rebukes, also aroused by their rejection of, quote, dialectical materialism, of these two former sympathizers of his, see Something in Russian and Marxism as a Science, published in The Nation on the 5th of July 1933, letter to Hook apparently written in English only. End footnote. These were manifestations at the time, as their counterparts were today, of, quote, petty bourgeois opportunism, end quote. Footnote. Trotsky used this, quote, label frequently, both as a term of abuse and as a definition of what Trotsky saw as the historical tendency within certain elements in the Marxist movement to revise the basic tenets of Marxism by way of accommodation to, quote, bourgeois norms. End footnote. As against this, it was no accident that all the genuine revolutionaries, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Mehring, and others, always insisted on the inviolability of, quote, dialectical materialism. What is this, quote, dialectical materialism? In 3 or 4 condensed pages, Trotsky summarized dialectical materialism's fundamental principles, dialectical materialism's ABC, as Trotsky called it. That piece will be up on the channel eventually if it isn't already. Without, however, avoiding the well-known cliches and simplifications which usually accompany Marxist explanations of the, quote, dialectic. Thus Trotsky reverted first to the old Aristotelian logic about, quote, A never being equal to, quote, A. All things exist in time. Time never stops, and existence itself is therefore a permanent process of transformation. From this logic, it was merely a step for him to the notion of the dialectic, according to which at a certain critical point quantitative changes have qualitative consequences. This was true of chemical phenomena as well as those of physics and biology. Quote, dialectical processes, therefore, are to be found in nature. Quantity and quality are there, as are the reconciliation between opposites and development through contradictions. Thus, from the syllogism of Aristotle's logic, we arrive at the quote laws of Hegelian dialectics. But the quote dialectic is not real in the idealistic sense given to the dialectic by Hegel. The dialectic is real by virtue of the dialectic's material character. The dialectic's roots are, quote, neither in heaven nor in the depths of our, quote, free will, end quote, but in objective reality, ... Consciousness grew out of the unconscious, psychology out of physiology, the organic world out of the inorganic, the solar system out of nebulae, end quote. Trotsky. What, however, did all this have to do with the study of society and the formulation of Marxist revolutionary policy and strategy? Nowhere did Trotsky give a satisfactory answer to this question. Beyond the truism that from the general one can learn about the particular, from, quote, dialectical materialism about, quote, historical materialism, politics, Trotsky believed, was, quote, concentrated economics, and economics, in the Marxist sense, was a particular manifestation of the material world. In any case, the issue, as Trotsky saw it, was whether practical activity was ensconced within the shell of a defined and consistent philosophical outlook. For, removed from the shell or deprived of the shell, it not only lost a, quote, roof over its head, but became exposed and vulnerable to every passing wind. True, Marxist philosophy was not, quote, eternal and immutable. Like all, quote, scientific thought, Marxist philosophy would undergo development and be incorporated into a more refined, quote, doctrine. But to reject it now because it was imperfect was analogous to a physician refusing to utilize the present knowledge and tools of medicine on the grounds that they were incomplete. Thus, it should be made clear to every Marxist that if he were to, quote, divorce sociology from dialectical materialism and politics from sociology, end quote, he would, in the end, paralyze his capacity for political activity. This was the gist of Trotsky's defense of Marxism in general, of, quote, dialectical materialism in particular. The merest glance at Trotsky's argument shows that this was Trotsky at his dogmatic hortatory worst. In the first place, it was clever, but hardly honest of Trotsky to transform every past and present controversy within the Marxist camp into one involving Marxist philosophy. Did Bernstein, for example, break with orthodox Marxism because of, quote, dialectical materialism, or because Bernstein had become convinced that Marxist social theory and practice were erroneous? For the most part, Trotsky was putting the proverbial cart before the horse. Even worse, however, was Trotsky's appeal to authority. Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on, the, quote, founding fathers of the creed Trotsky was defending. Since Marx, Engels, Lenin had presumably venerated, quote, dialectical materialism had to be considered sacred, and to deviate from dialectical materialism was therefore tantamount to committing a sin. But this was, of course, no argument at all, merely the trundling out of holy apparitions from the Marxist pantheon. This and the overall intolerant tone of Trotsky's polemic was not entirely unlike, in fact only too reminiscent of, the manner in which Trotsky's arch-fiend Stalin had decreed in ideological, not to mention other matters, and against Trotsky himself above all. Was Trotsky here exposing a similar strain in Trotsky's character? And, if so, was it not significant that this strain should emerge at a time when his own authority, in this case as the leader of his own Marxist, quote, opposition movement, threatened to be undermined by desertions and deviations? As to the substantive part of Trotsky's argument, who could take seriously the almost naive and certainly absurd explanation of scientific phenomena in terms of dialectical processes? Even Engels' writings in this connection appear at least more learned by comparison. The idea, moreover, that, quote, dialectical materialism was the method and tool of Marxism like surgery and the scalpel were of medicine, was patently false historically. The method, if anything, was the economic analysis of society, and the tool, if anything, was the party, its organization and leadership. The one possible rational explanation for Trotsky's uncharacteristically crude argumentation may, however, be contained in another of Trotsky's points, namely in the claim that to become hostile or even indifferent to, quote, dialectical materialism was to begin chipping away at the whole structure of Marxism. This in itself was no argument for the validity of the, quote, dialectic, of course, but it was a psychological insight into the often fragile character of a revolutionary movement. Trotsky may be seen to have sensed that its stability and confidence depended on a comprehensive, even totalist ideology, impregnable at every point. The less all-encompassing it became, or the more it was penetrated by ideas having their source elsewhere, the greater was the danger that, firstly, internal loyalty would become disturbed and, secondly, the rest of the edifice would become susceptible to questioning. Then skepticism, and would finally become under general attack. In this wide sense, Trotsky was right to see in the turning upon Marxist philosophy the beginning of a possibly total renunciation of Marxism. This fear would explain why Trotsky should have chosen to appear at this time as the virtual spokesman for Marxist dogma. But Trotsky performed this function in a particularly intolerant, extremist fashion. Trotsky's argument that a Marxist could not remain a Marxist, no matter what his social and political commitments, if he adopted, for example, the, quote, American pragmatist, end quote, philosophy, was perhaps analogous to the view that a Jew could not remain a Jew no matter what his national and cultural loyalties, if he converted to, for example, the Catholic faith. This in itself was not an unreasonable contention. The difficulty began, however, when Trotsky argued that the avoidance of, quote, conversion was not enough, as if to remain a Jew or Marxist, one had to be an Orthodox Jew or Marxist. Nevertheless, at the time of Trotsky's, quote, philosophical polemic, the fear that the other, social and political, tenets of Marxism would also come under attack had in any case largely materialized. It is doubtful whether this had anything to do with questions of, quote, dialectical materialism. The causes were more obvious, more empirical, and more pragmatic. Amongst them one could list, firstly, the general failure of the, quote, proletarian revolution in the West. Secondly, the relative stability and powers of recovery of the capitalist economic system. And thirdly, the very doubtful, certainly from a socialist point of view, character of the developments in the Soviet Union. All this, and more, suggested that Marx's social and historical theories had not stood the test of time and experience, and that the heyday of revolutionary activity had receded into the past. The, quote, crisis in Marxism, therefore, was, as usual, both theoretical and practical. In defending Marxism, Trotsky had thus now to carry the fight onto a second level as well. Not only the validity of Marxist philosophy had to be maintained and safeguarded, but the very stature of Marxism as a, quote, science. It cannot be said that safeguarding Marxism as a, quote, science was an easier task, nor can it be said that Trotsky was any more successful in carrying it out than Trotsky was in arguing the case for, quote, dialectical materialism. Though Trotsky was at great ease in this field, and though Trotsky's tone and arguments were less shrill, less crudely dogmatic, and less bullying, they too did not amount to much more than a standard restatement of points, as if taken from a Marxist textbook. Worst of all, however, was the fact that they exuded an optimism and a certainty which, given the situation at the time, were remarkable for their excesses. Consider, for example, one of Trotsky's first forays in the 1930s into this field of Marxist apologetics. This is a preface he wrote in 1937 to an Afrikaans translation of the Communist Manifesto. Footnote: 90 Years of the Communist Manifesto, first published in English in The New International, February 1938, and included in The Age of Permanent Revolution, a Trotsky anthology. All subsequent references are to the latter source. End footnote. Half of the preface consists of a list of some 12, quote, ideas contained in the manifesto which, according to Trotsky, quote, retain their full force today. Amongst these are items as general as the, quote, materialist conception of history, and as specific as the well-known prediction by Marx and Engels about the, quote, impoverishment of the working class. The first, of course, is a matter of Marxist doctrine, and Trotsky may be forgiven the mere expression of faith in its validity. But the impoverishment of the workers is surely an empirical point, requiring hard evidence. That the evidence was, to say the least, uncertain does not seem to have bothered Trotsky unduly. One should not confuse, Trotsky says, the, quote, labor aristocracy with the proletariat, and in any case, one should not take a, quote, fleeting tendency as permanent, end quote. Trotsky. So much for empiricism. The task Trotsky makes for the other 10, quote, ideas is not much better. Footnote. In fact, most of these, quote, ideas, not surprisingly, are in the, quote, general category, e.g. the class struggle, the, quote, withering away of the state, end quote, which perhaps gives Trotsky the feeling that he is free not to bother with direct empirical evidence. End footnote. In the second half of the preface, Trotsky lists 8 points in the manifesto, which, in Trotsky's view, require, quote, corrections and additions, end quote, in the, quote, light of experience, the supreme criterion of human reason, end quote. Trotsky. However, this time the reader will be forgiven if, after perusing these 8 points, the reader wonders what it is in Marxism that requires, quote, corrections and additions, end quote, that has not already been corrected and added to by Leninism. For the points are nothing else than a concise summary of the main tenets of Lenin's thought, from the theory of imperialism as monopoly capitalism to the revolutionary role of national liberation movements in the, quote, oppressed colonial, end quote, countries. Footnote. One point of correction, however, is Trotsky's own, namely the theory of permanent revolution in the context of backward societies. Less than 2 years later, Trotsky wrote another preface, this time to a popular English abridgment of the first volume of Capital. 1 second. Footnote. Marxism in Our Time in The Living Thoughts of Karl Marx, presented by Leon Trotsky, published in London, 1940. The title of the preface as here given does not appear in this, its original publication, but is the title Trotsky gave it in subsequent separate reprintings of it, although it has also sometimes appeared under the title Marxism in the United States. In the original version, a few passages were deleted, apparently by the publisher, but these are insubstantial since they concern mainly the style of some harsh remarks about certain American public figures. End footnote. This, too, must be seen as a feeble exercise in Marxist apologetics. It begins as, ostensibly, a summary of Marx's economic views. Before long, however, we are into an analysis of the American economy which, Trotsky finds, perfectly confirms most, if not all, of Marx's predictions for capitalism in general. The example of the United States is seen to bear out the thesis of the, quote, increasing misery of the workers and the parallel, quote, pauperization of the middle classes. American capitalism, Trotsky believes, has no hope of peaceful development. The New Deal, which is a policy of, quote, sops to the labor and farmer aristocracy, cannot avert the, quote, collapse of the economy. A collapse is inevitable, as is the coming socialist revolution in America. Marx's teachings, hitherto largely ignored in the United States, will soon gain influence in Marx, will soon gain influence, and Marx, quote, will become the mentor of the advanced American workers, end quote. Finally, colonial uprisings will aggravate and accelerate the catastrophe of capitalism. The proletariat in the imperialist countries will join hands against its own governments with the oppressed of the colonies. Most of this, of course, does not require the advantage of hindsight to be seen for what it is. It was already either wrong or grossly far-fetched when it was written. If nothing else, then the gradual recovery of the American economy from the Depression, which began a decade earlier, should have given Trotsky reason to at least temper his overconfident prognostications concerning the socialist future. But Trotsky had never had much success predicting developments in the West. In the mid-1920s, Trotsky made an almost wild foreboding of doom for Britain. In the 1920s, also, Trotsky greatly overestimated, for one reason or another, the prospects of revolution in Europe in general. Footnote: see chapters 8 and 9 above on Trotsky's evaluation of the then situation in Germany in particular. End footnote. Now, in the 1930s, Trotsky compounded his past errors by drawing a picture of the United States which was so one-sided as to mislead Trotsky entirely about the United States' future. Footnote: of Trotsky's numerous writings and statements on the United States, the following are further examples of a fundamental misunderstanding of American society. Something in Russian, If America Should Go Communist, originally published in Liberty magazine, 23rd of March, 1935. The Discussions of 1938 with Trotsky's followers on the formation of an American Marxist Labor Party, and the 1940 interview with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, published in Russian as Something in Russian in 1940. End footnote. Given this confidence, the, quote, crisis of Marxism hardly existed for Trotsky, or if it did, Trotsky preferred to largely ignore it. Thus, Trotsky could declare in 1939, quote, Marx has been proved right in every element of his analysis, as well as in his, quote, catastrophic prognosis, in what then consists the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, Trotsky. For those who had abandoned Marxism because of disillusionment with Marxism's, quote, scientific claims, Trotsky had nothing but contempt. Footnote: see, for example, his article Something in Russian, published in February 1939. End footnote. The only Marxist, quote, crisis Trotsky was prepared to recognize as real and serious was of a different kind, prevailing in the Soviet Union. There, Trotsky agreed, Marxist philosophy and science, as sources of intellectual advancement, had been stultified by the intellectual bankruptcy of Stalin's regime. Not a single Marxist work, Trotsky claimed, had emerged under Stalin. In philosophy, history of the social sciences, which, quote, deserves attention, or which, quote, transcends the limits of scholastic compilations. Which, quote, transcends the limit of scholastic compilations. Scholastic compilations, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. That quote was from The Revolution Portrayed. During the early 1920s, Trotsky had attempted to encourage empirical studies, using Marxist methods of social and historical development. Trotsky himself once suggested a research project which would investigate the historical relation, over a period of about a century, between capitalist economic development and political events. The aim of the project would be to see how economic changes were reflected in the, quote, superstructure of society. Although Trotsky warned against vulgar schematization, his own approach to this project was entirely free of a certain schematism. End footnote. To flourish, Trotsky maintained, Marxism, like every science, needed to be free of every, quote, shadow of compulsion, end quote. Trotsky. so long as Marxism remained under the official aegis of the state, Marxism would produce nothing but the, quote, same old ideas, the, quote, same old quotations, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. No doubt Trotsky expressed a sincere sentiment when thus calling for the emancipation of science in general and of Marxism in particular in the Soviet Union. Footnote: to Trotsky's credit, it should be pointed out that Trotsky also pleaded for the freedom of science while he was still in the Soviet Union. In the previously referred to 1925 speech on Mendeleev, Trotsky stressed that while science should aim at being, quote, useful to society, theoretical research, even if its practical consequences were doubtful or unforeseen, was absolutely essential. End footnote. But Trotsky's own approach in the late 1930s to the doctrines of Marxism raised doubts about the extent of free opinion, which Trotsky himself was prepared to tolerate. In effect, Trotsky's views on Marxist dogma left little room for any genuine debate over central issues, and Trotsky's exercises in, quote, Marxology themselves produced largely the, quote, same old ideas and same old quotations, end quote, same old quotations. Reading these exercises, one should perhaps be grateful that Trotsky wrote as little as he did in this field. It was obviously not his forte. Trotsky's mind was at its most creative when pursuing the independent analysis of social and historical problems, away from texts and issues of doctrine. Trotsky was at his best when conceptualizing concrete phenomena, at his worst when interpreting and preaching dogma. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.